have, I don't know who it is, but somebody talking about, that the end goal of family ministry is not families sitting around the couch or whatever, singing Kumbaya. It's about families making disciples who make disciples. And I like that, what he's saying there, because it's not just about, mom and dad and 2 kids or 7 or how many ever, and they can recite catechism questions and this kind of thing, but that they are seeking to help each other follow Jesus as they help others to follow Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. So I'd add just a couple things to that. I think one thing a church can do to have both of these at the same time is, I think that in their an emphasis on family discipleship, I think we should celebrate all parental figures, all people who do that hard work, even if it's just temporary, like foster parenting, the hard work of raising up children in the Lord. And I think especially do this with the kids around. If you're doing children's ministry, if you talk about, about how we honor dads on Father's Day, this is being recorded before Father's Day. That kind of thing. You can also say, that if you don't have, if your spiritual leader is your grandfather or your best friend's dad or something like that, we can honor them. And so I think being inclusive and bringing up some of these untraditional, and not as a way of shaming them, but as a way of celebrating all kinds of parental figures that God certainly uses. And I think also we don't enforce things that the Bible doesn't require, because I think sometimes when we do that, that could cause that kind of thing, that could cause being insensitive to untraditional cases. So for one example of that would be at our church, we do on Wednesday nights for the youth, they all get these discussion points for the roads. They're called car combos. I make these car combos every week. Some discussion points related to the youth lesson that we just had. And I encourage parents to do them with their youth, and some of them do. But it would be wrong for me to tell them you have to, because the Bible doesn't say you have to do car combos from Pastor Tony. And it would be wrong for me to say, that if your household's a household without somebody who's going to lead in that, in car combos, that there's something inherently wrong with your household.
That's a good point. Yeah, you can't put something on someone's conscience that the Bible doesn't. But I do really like what you're saying about trying to honor and hold up all those that are in those parental roles of influence and authority, and celebrating that, thanking God for it.
And how do kids in broken homes or with lost parents even that don't know the Lord behave a little different at church sometimes when we have these kind of people in church?
Well, they might curse. They might have outbursts of anger. They might be disobedient or disruptive. But that could be from believing homes too. They may be lost in what you're doing. They may question what you're talking about, whether they're just inquiring, like, what do you mean? Or they're actually actively challenging it. It can take – I've seen it take form in a lot of different ways. So back when I was a kid, I was involved in the Awana program that our church had, and there was an apartment complex right next to the church. And the kids that came from those apartments often were a little bit rough, came from kind of rough homes. And I remember getting frustrated. And I was a young elementary kid, but I remember getting frustrated because we'd have to stop at times, and we couldn't keep playing our game or whatever that I wanted to win at because some leader had to go deal with a discipline problem, with the kid that was yelling at somebody or cursing or just not listening. And then, in my own ministry, I've seen some of those kinds of things. But yeah, it's just a reality that you got to deal with. But again, it's not that, the kids from unbelieving homes, they're inherently worse. I have problems sometimes with kids that come from believing homes as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple things I'll add to that is I think you do have some of those struggles, but also in some ways I think there can be a blessing of these kind of untraditional situations. I think sometimes church kids can have an attitude that that they can't share. Some of the deeper struggles, like that almost hide things. And so they rely upon the unchurched people or the less church people to be a little bit more honest about. I know of a case where we've had an unchurched person that visited our youth group, and I was teaching a lesson. I was interacting with the youth, and I don't believe that. And I wonder, sometimes I wonder if some of the church kids also just don't believe it, but they don't want to say it. And I think it allows you to have more deep interactions that you wouldn't have if you only had the church type kids. But I do think, they also won't get church language. They won't get these churchy language that we like to use, even some big right theological terms. They will have no idea what you're talking about if you talk about sanctification, and you need to be very mindful of that.
I think that's a great point, because you can run into that with smaller children as well as youth, just using some of the common Christian vernacular. And sanctification is a biblical term, but even some of our more churchy, pious language, surrender is one that's very popular around here. Now, I think they may be able to get a little sense of that, but you start talking about, being led by the Spirit, or again, that's biblical language. Asking Jesus into your heart, things like that. I think you just have to be very careful.
Yeah. So, with all that said, is it possible to actually do both of these things? To be a church that reaches more unchurched kids, while at the same time being a church that projects strong focus on parental discipleship? Can we have both of those realistically?
Sure. With God, all things are possible. I think the key, you don't make family ministry the main thing, though we think it's important, but you make Jesus and his gospel the main thing. And how you're talking to and teaching and preaching and counseling and ministering to younger people within that framework is going to sound different than to their parents anyway, though you are trying to point them to their parents regularly and to esteem their parents. You're not so much talking to the kids about their parents' job to disciple them. And so you can still have fruitful ministry to unchurched kids, even while you are putting a heavy emphasis on family and parental spiritual nurturing.
Yeah, that's good. So one actual overt example of this I know of is, I haven't been to Dallas in many years, but I know a lot about God's work through the Village Church and down in Dallas, Texas, Matt Chandler's church. And I know that church is a church that really heavily emphasizes family discipleship for parents, but at the same time, it is a church that is known for reaching a lot of unchurched people, including unchurched children. And so I think that's, even if that's just one example, it's an example that it's not mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination. But I actually even think like an emphasis on family ministry, a strong focus on parental discipleship can even sometimes, especially in today, in a time where parents that aren't church are going to be less trusting of the local church, might even help our witness to their kids, might make them more willing to trust us with their children, because they know that we're a people that really talks up the role of parents, that really tells the kids how important the role of parents are, and we're a people that communicate with parents like nobody else does. And I think that can actually even add to our witness to kids.
I think that's an excellent point.
How can parents who do disciple their kids help their kids be patient and kind to those other kids in the church, the other kids that are difficult, those kids that without the Christian parents?
Well, you want to work at cultivating humility and thankfulness at God's grace to them. Assuming that the child's a believer. But even if not, probably their behavior at church is going to look a little different. And so you're just trying to help them see, like, you don't deserve God's favor and his grace and his mercy. You may want to take them to the Pharisees and how they have this condescension towards others, and just working to help them see their own hearts. And I think there's a place, depending on their age and maturity level, at pointing out some of the different factors that distinguish one's home life from the other, and helping, maybe cultivating some compassion for them, and encouraging them to look for ways to bless those other kids.
Yeah, that's great. I would add to this. We need to teach our kids that church is a place for the sick. And it's the place for the sick because we're all sick. We're all spiritual sick. We're all sinners. And with that, the sin of the unchurched might be a bit different than the sin of the church kids. And I think we tend to project these kinds of sin as being the worst sins. But unchurched unchurchy, non-churchy sins aren't necessarily worse. And so there are some times that, that church kids might be the worst gossip on the block, but they're not going to be transgender in the way that, that an unchurched kid might be. I might identify against the gender that God has created them in. But we might act like, we have our kids prepared to react vitriol towards this unchurched kid with a sin that's really different. But the Bible does not portray it that way. The Bible, in fact, is so strong against some of the sins that are prevalent even in our churchy kids and our churchy selves, that it says the little sins that we don't talk about much, like gossip, are very much worthy of the wrath of God in the same way that the unchurchy sins are.
That's a really good point. Things that we find more acceptable, we're a little gentler with, and then those other things where it's like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe you. Now, when I was younger at that same church, it was a good church, but so I'm not trying to rip that church, but it was a King James only church. And I remember being like in middle school and some people showing up with like the New International Version in Sunday school, and they'd read out loud, and it was like, did you hear that? Like, what is wrong with them? And then this is kids that actually showed up with the Bible, not kids, came up and dropped the F-bomb during Sunday school. So, but yeah, it just, kids their maturity level is going to be lower. Yeah,
definitely. So, how can parents envelope these kinds of kids into these friends of their kids that don't know the Lord into their own families and discipleship?
I think showing hospitality towards those kids and seeking to try to show it with their families as well, getting to know the families, but showing interest in the kids. Trying to have conversation, offering them rides to church, even including them in family worship when they're in your home, and trying to have spiritual conversations with them. I mean, those are some pretty just mundane things, but just trying to mesh their lives some with your own kids and trusting that the Lord will give opportunity for godly character to come out, but also for direct spiritual truth to be shared.
I think you've got a lot of good points. And I really liked your emphasis on the hospitality in that, and that there's a need to, not just effectively bring in, but literally envelope in these kind of kids. And so it's funny because I think that sometimes Christian households can be the most reluctant to have a non-church teen or a non-church kid or the lost neighbor into the household. But I think we need to be the kind of places that welcome in, that bring in even the friends of our kids that we're not necessarily the world's biggest fans of, so long as and that's a discernment issue, but I think we can love on and bring in a way that tries to really reach and tries to disciple them. So I know of a case that some friends of ours that really has invited neighbors over during their times of family worship. Some neighbors that are lost, and it was really even enveloped them into that act of family worship as a way to disciple even the neighborhood, as a way to bring on even unchurched kids and share that same gospel hope that they're sharing to their own children. I think that's a great example of it. And because I think really then in that case it can be a spiritual seedbed for these kids. It can be the bedrock from which these lost kids, these unchurched kids that may even be one day allowed to go along with you to church if their parent is on board with it. It can be the way that they see their connection to the faith.
Yeah, that's good.
And how can adult Christians act as spiritual mothers and fathers of teenagers without mothers, or teenagers without fathers who disciple them in the Word?
Some of the things we just talked about are some excellent ways. I think, especially as the kids get older and just sort of forming more mature relationships, letting them know that you're there to talk about life in general to them, that you're a supportive adult, because kids are going to, whether they're younger kids or teenagers, they're going to appreciate someone who seems to have things together, has some wisdom, and especially depending on the level of brokenness that they experience in their home. And neither one of us think that everybody that's lost